Welcome. I'm Tom Billington, the host of Billington Federal CyberByte, sponsored by Cisco. Today's interview addresses the most timely topic, the new cybersecurity executive order and its impact on the software industry. I have the honor of introducing to you Dr. Ron Ross, a fellow at NIST, who leads the FISMA implementation project and the systems security engineering project. After Ron, you will hear from Bruce Brody, the senior CISO Advisor for Cisco. He's the former Chief Information Security Officer for the Department of Energy and the Department of Veterans Affairs. Again, we really appreciate Cisco for making this interview series possible, and thank you for joining us. Ron, what do you think is the significance of the President's executive order on cybersecurity?
Tom, I think the significance of the EO is just enormous. I think you have to look at the context of what we're going through in cyber for the past decade or two. We've had incredible innovation in our systems and our technologies, but that incredible innovation and that capability that we now have through the great technology has also given us some significant vulnerabilities. And a lot of this comes with the sheer complexity of the systems that we're building. Trillions of lines of code, billions of devices, all connected up over 4G going to 5G networks. And so I think the real purpose of the cyber security EO, the supply chain security EO, is to improve the quality of the software. And you also have to remember that we are experiencing a massive convergence of cyber and physical systems. These computers now that are in everything, controlled by software and firmware, are driving very critical systems. And so I think when you look at that convergence of cyber and physical systems, the software and the firmware and the quality of those components becomes a very significant issue. And of course, our vulnerabilities in the software and the systems come from typically three areas. We can have vulnerabilities in requirements, flawed requirements, incomplete requirements, inconsistent requirements. We can also have vulnerabilities that come through the development process. The way that you develop code and systems and software makes a difference. Secure coding techniques, there's disciplined and structured processes that you can employ that help reduce the number of weaknesses and deficiencies in the code. And that ultimately translates to fewer vulnerabilities for customers on the customer side. And then the last place is the operations side. People, they're going to make mistakes, and sometimes those vulnerabilities pop up because the way the systems and the software components are used. So the significance of the executive order really is pretty simple. It's to improve the quality of the software that goes into our critical systems.
Thank you, Ron. Given that, how does the system security engineering work that you have been championing at NIST for so long and so brilliantly, how does that fit into the goals of the EO?
Well, this is the part that I'm really excited about, because I use the analogy of building a house. If you want to build a good house, a quality house, it starts with good components that you're going to use to build the house. And I think that's the part where the executive order is trying to improve those component products that are going into those critical systems. Now, that's really the necessary part, but not sufficient. Those products then, which are largely commercial products without a context of how they're going to be used, they get deployed into real systems with a context, real stakeholders, real mission business requirements. And there's a lot of those products coming together in the context of giving a system a certain capability to support the mission or the business operations. That's where systems security engineering and systems engineering comes into play, because systems engineers and security engineers have to deal with a variety of different types of products. Some are highly assured, highly trusted, others are not. And they put those products together. We call those system elements. Could be an operating system, could be an application, middleware, could be a database management system, a person, a process, a procedure. All of these elements come together, and the engineers have to do what they call trade space analysis, trade space decisions. They can pick and choose the types of products that have the levels of assurance, and those products are interacting with each other. So in order to really lock down systems and make them more secure, more trustworthy, and more resilient, you have to have the engineers working with these good piece parts. Just like building a house starts with good products, then there's a good architectural design for the house, and then there's skilled craftsmen that come in and take those products and they build the house according to the architectural specification. So the engineering side, the SSE part that I'm working on, deals with what do you do with all those products when you're trying to assemble those into a system that customers can trust, especially if they're in very critical areas of our economy or our federal systems or the critical infrastructure.
To create that trust you've just described, how does the EO develop trustworthy, secure systems, making our most critical systems less susceptible to successful cyber attacks by the most sophisticated threat actors?
Right, that's the big question today, Tom, is because as I mentioned, as those products start to improve in the quality, we reduce the number of weaknesses and deficiencies and kind of tamp down the number of vulnerabilities. The customer still has to build that system and deal with the system on the other end. Now, one of the things with these sophisticated adversaries, back in the old days, several decades ago, we used to have this illusion that we could stop the adversaries at the front door. But today we know that's not true. Even with our best products and our most sophisticated cybersecurity tools and techniques, there's still a small number, a small percentage of those high-end cyber attacks that you just mentioned that may get through our best defenses. Some people may call that the advanced persistent threat. So this executive order, if it actually fulfills the objective of getting better quality piece parts, the engineers then can take those and engineer systems that not only can help stop the bad guys at the front end, but if they do get in, they can limit the damage the adversaries can inflict once they're inside the system. That's the kind of the new thinking. We have to be prepared to engage the adversary, not from the outside in, but from the inside out. And that's where you're going to start to see, even in the EO, where you're starting to see the words called zero trust concepts, zero trust architecture. What that means is that it's part of an architecture that once the adversaries are inside, it's like breaking the lock on your front door lets you in the house. But if the bad guys can rip through every room in your house and steal you blind, you're going to lose a lot of stuff. But what if the adversaries or the bad guys coming in your house, every room in your house had a vault or a safe in that room? The adversary then has to get into every one of those vaults. And what that does, it increases their work factor. It makes their jobs a lot harder. They have an attack sequence that they have to go through. Anytime we can disrupt or break that attack sequence, it makes it more difficult. And we have a lot of great technologies coming out of industry, micro virtualization, micro segmentation, that will support the concept of zero trust. You basically try to slow the lateral movement down the adversary, increase the work factor, and also limit the time on target. There's some tremendous new technologies coming down the pike now. Some are already here, where you can micro virtualize, which means if you get malicious code in your system, you can flush it out very quickly because that virtualization process can refresh those components almost instantaneously. So when you combine limiting the adversary's lateral movement and reducing their time on target, you basically now make their lives miserable once they've gotten through your initial defenses. What those two things lead to, stopping them at the front door, limiting the damage, leads to something we call cyber and system resilience. That's being able to withstand a sophisticated cyber attack and continue to operate even if you're in a degraded or a debilitated state. Now, that's not important for maybe the home users, but if you're talking about critical infrastructure, power plants, things that really matter where lives are at stake, this is a national imperative. So the EO is kind of the first step in the team sport here. We have to really bring our A game in so many different areas, and we don't have a lot of time to get this done. So I'm excited that we've got some new tasks at NIST. Just thrilled to death to work with industry and our partners, government, industry, academia. We're going to get on top of this, and we're going to solve this problem so we can all be safer and more secure.
Thanks very much, Dr. Ross.
Thank
our
you.
country benefits enormously from your service. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Tom.
Well, Bruce Brody, thank you for being with us.
My pleasure.
How is this executive order different from previous ones in its impact from your viewpoint on industry?
So this executive order goes a little farther than previous executive orders. There have been many executive orders, presidential decision directives. They come from the desk of the president, and they carry with them broad policy statements that, when enacted or if enacted, can create significant momentum in getting things done across the executive branch. What I particularly like about this one is that it mentions the importance of threat information, threat sharing between public and private sector. It goes into a little bit of detail on the kinds of outcomes the government would like to see in terms of how agencies adapt certain practices and procedures like multi-factor authentication and zero trust. And it does hit on, as Ron was mentioning, the software supply chain. If you could create a perfect future where the federal government is operating in a zero trust architecture with multi-factor authentication, and there's significantly higher degrees of assurance for the software that it operates, we would be in a much better end state. But one of the points Ron made was this is a team sport, and going from an executive order to actual practice takes quite a bit of effort.
Thank you. As a former federal CISO, how can this EO move the needle in the never-ending challenge of implementing effective cybersecurity and risk management across the whole federal government?
This is the first executive order that I've seen that that actually threatens to use the buying power, the immense buying power of the federal government in areas such as acquiring software and straightening out the federal acquisition regulation. In fact, NIST, as of last week, published a definition of critical software. And that definition will then move forward to the Department of Homeland Security and be turned into language that will eventually get into the federal acquisition regulation, so that a year from now, companies that bid work into the federal government will be required to attest that their software meets certain levels of assurance. And that had not been done before. And it's not likely that any of these companies that produce these software tools and capabilities will produce a separate set of software for their commercial customers than for their federal customers. So it's likely that we will have tightened up the software supply chain by virtue of the immense buying power of the federal government, and that can only lead to a good outcome.
Final question, is this executive order, in your view, sufficient to achieve positive results, or is an active legislation ultimately necessary?
In my opinion, this executive order takes a number of very important steps in the right direction. It does compel federal agencies to act in ways that they might not otherwise been inclined to act. I fear that as an executive order, maybe a year or two from now, some other significant incident on the magnitude of SolarWinds or the pipeline could compel another executive order to be written, and then another executive order after that. Legislation is where you put into law those dictates, mandates, and requirements for federal agencies and for commercial industry that also carry significant penalties if not adhered to. We are 8 years out from FISMA 2013. It is at least 10 years out of date in terms of the kinds of concepts and thought processes that went into it. It is high time for Congress to consider a new FISMA, whether it's FISMA 3.0 or whether it's some new word entirely, so that we begin managing the way we acquire, manage, operate information systems and software to be more in tune with the decade of the 2020s and beyond.
Thank you very much, Bruce, and thank you for your decades of service to our country. We appreciate it.